All right, I'm an anthropologist, and my interest is trying to figure out what makes human beings humans. So I study things that are as different from me as possible. So I spent 20 years in the Maya rainforest trying to figure out how you can survive in a rainforest, and almost as much time with mujahideen and suicide bombers and people like that, trying to figure out what makes them tick. The interesting thing for me is not terrorism per se. It's why so few people, perhaps never before in history, have so few people with so few means cause such fear in so many. For example, in the United States, about 9 people a year are killed by terrorist attacks. That's much less than are killed by lawnmower. And yet it dominates our political discourse and was very instrumental in the present election, in the election of the last president. It dominates the world's political headlines, and it represents what I think is a structural flaw in the way the world system is set up. That I'll try to get to at the end, but I want to deal with the people who actually join these movements in the first place. So this comes out of some work. I'm at the CNRS, but we also have a group called Artists International, and our European branch is the Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflicts at Oxford. And it's a team that involves a bunch of different people. Former White House people, Director of Terrorism Prevention, the White House Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security, former Deputy Commander of the multinational forces in Iraq, who was brought in to undo the Abu Ghraib scandal, political scientists like Robert Axelrod, tit-for-tat guy, evolution of cooperation, and some very, very interesting people. I usually pick people on my team not for their academic credentials as such, but because they get along with people. So for Lydia Wilson, for example, who you'll see, she got her degree from Cambridge in medieval Arabic and philosophy of science. She founded the Cambridge Literary Review. She writes for the LRB. Hoshang Waziri is an Arab playwright. But these people are Nafis Hamid, studied in neuroscience with Pat Churchland, but he is an actor, screenwriter. And these are people who get along with other people, and these are the people I actually need in the field. So the overall framework is, for me at least, how is it that humans make their greatest exertions, including killing and dying, not for their own gain, lives, or family, but for an idea, a transcendent moral conception of who I am and who we are. And this is the privilege of absurdity to which no creature but man is subject, of which Thomas Hobbes wrote in Leviathan. Nothing perhaps is more interesting than the religious aspect, although there's also secularized versions of transcendental beliefs, of the isms I talked about yesterday. Religious beliefs, let's look at religious beliefs for a minute. Why are they so important? So religious beliefs are basically absurd in the sense that they represent not false ideas, but category mistakes, what Aristotle called things like three-footed ideas. They're literally absurd. You can't prove them false, you can't prove them true, you can't empirically verify them, you can't test them for logical coherence. For example, God is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. What the hell does that mean? Or God is 3 in 1. As Galileo and Hobbes themselves said, that's literally incomprehensible. And when we do experiments like little Johnny, he's in Wisconsin, his foot's caught under a rock, the water's rising, prays to God to save him. At the same moment, Mary, she's in Australia, she falls down on the railroad tracks, she prays to God to save her. What does God do? Well, we test rabbis and priests and normal people, and no one says, sham bang, well, thank you, ma'am, God just does it. They say, how fast is the train coming? Does little Mary have any brothers or sisters? Because you literally can't process these things. Yet they're extremely adaptable. And the paradox, perhaps, of human reason and unreason is that the greatest trust between human beings is anchored in transcendental beliefs that you cannot logically or empirically validate in any sense. And in fact, social contracts are an inherent disadvantage. Social contracts based on convenience of maximizing for the common good usually aren't very stable. They don't last usually long in history for more than 3 or 4 generations for a very simple fact. If it's a matter of cost and benefit convenience, that means there's always a better deal down the line. And if there's a better deal down the line and you're aware of it, it's always better to defect now. So those kinds of beliefs that that don't have exit strategies and have a very long shadow of the future tend to be much more stable. Now, one of the problems of religious beliefs, of course, is once you believe in them, and there's no exit strategy, they also tend to anchor conflicts. Well, throughout human history, if you look through recorded wars like the BBC War Survey or the Encyclopedia of Wars, you find only about 7% of wars in recorded history have anything to do with religion per se. But they do tend to be some of the most intractable wars. And it's also seemingly arbitrary ritual commitments that generate the greatest trust between human beings, and things that are absolutely absurd from an empirical point of view. So attempts for example, new atheist attempts to just argue these away as false beliefs and we don't need them and science can prove them wrong, basically go nowhere and will always go nowhere. So now I'm going to bring this sort of general discussion down to earth. So we have a team of academics, policymakers, former military, and artists to explore why people refuse political compromise, go to war, attempt revolution, or resort to terrorism, focusing on what Darwin called those virtues and values highly esteemed and even sacred that give immense advantage to any group of devoted actors willing to sacrifice for them. And our latest set of field work, this was the first battle for the retaking of Mosul. Here we're embedded with a Kurdish and Iraqi combined army unit at the most forward position, the Burj position, from which the attack was launched. In this first battle, there were 500 to 600 Peshmerga, Arab Sunni militia, Iraqi armed forces, PKK forces, and 93 Islamic State forces. And the idea was to give the Sunni villagers back control of their villages. So the Sunni militia attacked first, about 150 of them. They met some IEDs. They withdrew. The Peshmerga came in with the Iraqi army. And of those 93, over 50 were killed. There were over 20 suicide bombers called Ingamasi. These are trained to pierce lines. 7 of these guys blew themselves up to cover the retreat of the last 15. The village was finally secured after some very, very hard fighting, some that veterans who had been fighting since the 1960s said was the hardest battle in their lives. And the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army gave it to the Sunni tribes. And the Sunni tribes said, "Were you going to stay with us?" And they said, "No, we have to go back to Kurdistan." And they said, "Well, we're not staying here with these crazy people." And the next day, Islamic State walked right back in. So why do we have groups like the Islamic State? I mean, from a point of view, purely military point of view, the Belgian army could destroy the Islamic State in a matter of days. They have no heavy artillery. They have no air force. There's the coalition of 60 to 70 of the most powerful nations on earth against them. Of course, each has a knife in the other's back. And why are they resisting along a front of over 3,000 kilometers for well over 2 years? And if you look at insurgent and revolutionary movements since World War II, they on average beat out armies with up to 10 times more firepower and manpower for very simple reasons. Standard police and army function on the basis of material incentives and disincentives like pay, promotion, punishment, whereas these groups operate to a significant degree on the basis of belief and commitment in what they're doing. Now, we're not supposed to be there yet. The Frontline studies show that unconditional cooperation and intractable conflict is best understood within what I call a devoted actor framework rather than a rational actor framework that integrates 2 research paradigms I'm going to briefly talk about. Sacred values, whether religious or secular, as when land or law become holy or hallowed, and identity fusion, which gives a visceral sense of oneness and invulnerability to a group. So let's just look at identity fusion, for example. This was a measure originally developed by Bill Swan at the University of Texas, which we've developed into a dynamic measure for iPads and computers. Just consider one circle represents me, the larger one represents the group with different degrees of overlap between the circles. Those who choose the last pairing, E, think and behave differently than those who choose any other pairing on any discrete or continuous dimension. We all have multiple identities. People who are fused generally have one and only one identity, and they ratchet their sense of invincibility up. And this was first done, the studies were first done in Libya with guerrillas, where the people who choose E fighting Gaddafi actually literally took the paper and pencil and ripped up the last one, to show that there was no difference between us and them. And of course, we do experiments. They're sort of trivial, but psychologists like them, like trolley experiments, where we show that people are willing to sacrifice one another. Sacrifice their lives to help each and every one of the members of the groups they're fused with. Now, what about sacred values? So sacred values, well, hi. Sacred values, much more is known about economic decision-making than about value-driven decision-making. But here are some, I don't have a prospect theory of sacred values or anything like that, but here's some aspects of sacred values. They're immune to material trade-offs. Most of us wouldn't sell our children or sell out our country or religion for all the money in China. Of course, nearly all axioms of classical political and economic theory assume that all things are fungible. But in fact, for most human beings, that's not the case when push comes to shove. They're insensitive to temporal and spatial discounting. Again, in economic and political theory, things closer to you in the here and now are worth more than things in the far places and in far times. With sacred values, the opposite is often true. Things in far times and spaces may be much more valuable than things in the here and now. Think of the Exodus from Egypt, Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina, the Second Coming, or whatever you have. They're blind to exit strategies. It doesn't have to be religious. They can be secular. Think of Bolshevism or Nazism or any of the isms since the French Revolution. They have privileged links to the emotions. They generate actions independent of prospects of success, as we'll show you from the neuroimaging, because they're the right thing to do. And there's a backfire effect. The more you offer incentives, especially material incentives, the angrier people get, and the more they are likely to oppose negotiations and resort to violence. So we systematically find that offering material incentives, however reasonable or rewarding, or disincentives to abandon or compromise sacred values, only increases anger, violence, opposition to peace. Here are just some examples, but let me just give you one example, empirical. So what we did was, we did a between subjects study of Palestinian refugees and of Israeli settlers. These were Israeli settlers 4 days before they were going to be withdrawn from Gaza. We did this with thousands and randomized samples using census data. And the first group, we proposed a simple peace plan that was being negotiated in Geneva at the time. Would you give up, for example, the Palestinian right of return in exchange for permanent peace along the 1967 borders? We had just done a survey with the Palestinian Policy Survey Research Group headed by Khalil Shikaki, in which we showed that only 8% of Palestinian refugees would ever think of going back to Israel, but over 80% would never give up the right of return. Okay, so when we offered this, again, nearly 80% said no, they wouldn't take the deal. Then we offered what was a concrete, again being discussed at Geneva, material incentive of 10,000 euros more or less for each Palestinian family and 10 billion for the Palestinian Authority. Opposition to the deal went to ceiling. People became more angry, and support for suicide bombing, even among women, went to well over 70%. Again, remember, only 8% would even choose to go back if offered the deal. But you were violating what they considered a sacred value. Now, the third group, we did the same deal as the first two, but instead of any material incentive, we simply said, and the Israelis would apologize for the dislocation and dispossession of the Palestinian people in 1948 without any promise of material compensation. And opposition, even among the leaders, and this was in Science, we published this in Science and PNAS, we interviewed the leaders of the Hamas and Mr. Netanyahu and all these other people. Opposition to the peace went down significantly, okay, because this was simply a symbolic expression of recognition of the other person's sacred value. So these things actually do make a difference. The problem is, and I deal a lot with policymakers, in especially European and American policy, it's all about cost-benefit and business-like negotiations. And especially when sacred values are involved, not only does that go nowhere, it often backfires. So what we try to do is present the data to political leaders. Like we go to the White House, or we go to the Prime Minister's office here, and we try to present this data. And the problem, of course, is that academics, or at least some academics, and politicians think very differently. Academics are interested in truth and evidence. Politicians are interested in victory and persuasion. And they will only use evidence and truth when it serves the purposes of victory and persuasion. So it's a very tricky affair to use science with politicians, but still worthwhile. This is just the data.
And
No, no, I haven't showed it in the brain yet. No, this was a behavioral. No, this was just a behavioral study. Oh, this wasn't supposed to be here. Oh, I skipped one. Yes, you're right. So most recently, we did a neuroimaging of Al-Qaeda affiliate Lashkar-e-Taiba supporters who expressed greater willingness to fight and to die, thank you, for sacred values as opposed to non-sacred values. And they reacted much faster to stimuli containing sacred values. And willingness to fight and die for sacred values involved less activation in dorsolateral, inferior frontal, and parietal neural resources compared to non-sacred values, revealing what we think is lower involvement of areas associated with utilitarian reasoning and cognitive control of reaction times, emotional intensity, familiarity, and saliency were ruled out. They didn't have any effects whatsoever. So the reason we do I'm not a neuroimaging, Molly's a neuroimaging person. She was part of this team, very important part. The reason we do, at least I do neuroimaging, is for two reasons. One, you can serendipitously find very interesting things that you didn't know were related. For example, some of Molly's work shows that centers for joy and happiness, the neural circuits for joy and revenge overlap considerably, which has very interesting, significant implications for political theory. And what we tend to concentrate on is that these kinds of results show that this is not posturing. One of the things we get all the time is that, okay, people can say whatever they want, but they can't control their neural firings. But even more, I think, one of the big problems in social science, of course, is the great gap between what people say they'll do and what they actually do, even when you have the neuroimaging stuff. So that's one of the reasons we go to the battlefront. See, when people are actually fighting and dying and we can witness this, then the gap between what they'll say will do and what they actually do disappears. So we actually can monitor people being killed, wounded, how many times, how much effort they put into it, and that's what we did here. President Obama came out in September 2014, echoing the opinion of James Clapper as Director of National Intelligence, said the greatest mistake we made in Iraq was underestimating the will to fight of the Islamic State, overestimating the will to fight of the Iraqi army. And then he said, because will to fight is an imponderable. So our task was to go to the battlefield and find out whether in fact will to fight is ponderable or not. And we find it's eminently ponderable. Now, first, one of the things we find, remember I said sacred values and group fusion are two independent factors that predict willingness to make costly sacrifices. However, when they interact, then you get maximum willingness to fight and die. On the left is Al-Qaeda supporters and ISIS supporters in radical neighborhoods in Morocco. And on the right are the most devoted actors in Western Europe, in a Western European study of 6,500 people. We find that there are devoted actors, that the interaction of fusion and sacred values predicts willingness to fight and die. In the case of the Europeans, it was for democracy, freedom, and things like that. But it was at a much lower level in Europe than it was for supporters of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But the pattern was exactly similar. Now, we find three basic things that I consider the spiritual dimension of human conflict. And by that I mean most political and military theory is based on what's called cost imposition. You ratchet up the costs for the enemy until they surrender. But then you ask yourself, well, what cost can cause a suicide bomber to surrender? What cost can cause a truly committed actor to surrender? And if you think of human history and those paragon examples of human endeavor in war and violence, the ones that stand out are the ones where people wouldn't surrender under any circumstances. Thermopylae, the Alamo, Masada, things like that. And there's a reason for it, because they are the paragons of what human beings aspire to. Now, what we find in addition to the fusion, the complementarity between values and fusion. By the way, we also find that values actually trump group identity on the front line with ISIS, PKK, and the Peshmerga. which is very interesting because all military literature in sociology, psychology, and history says that the best predictor of will to fight is a group identity. We find that's very important, but we find for committed groups that's not the case. Values trump group identity, and when push comes to shove, they'll abandon even their closest buddies for the values. And we also find that among the most devoted actors, there are two other aspects. One, willingness to forsake family for those values. Now, that usually is the strongest group for all human beings, and there are genetic and evolutionary reasons for that to be the case. But if you look at political history, every large polity is based on the premise that you must be willing ultimately to sacrifice your family. Think of the great creation myths of the monotheistic religions, which is well over half of humanity, namely Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his most beloved son, Isaac, to slit his throat for God's greater message. He's not considered a murderer or a child molester, but the world's greatest cultural hero. Or think of the very word Islam, which means submission, mainly submission of tribal and genetic affinities to some greater message. So we find on the battlefield, actually, and we can map it in terms of number of times wounded and number of times suffered attacks. People most willing to forsake their family are those who fight the best. And in fact, we found this among the Waffen-SS when we did sort of historical archives. The Germans were by far the best fighters in World War II, especially the Waffen-SS. And the reason is they grew up together in the Hitler Youth. They actually believed in what they were doing. Usually, a military unit goes to entropy at 33%, 30 to 33% destruction. And that's the way the Israelis fought the Six-Day War. You'd hit a unit, you'd monitor it for destruction. If it was above 30%, you'd go on to the next one, so you didn't have to follow through. Well, for these kinds of groups, they can endure with well over 50%. But there's been almost no study of this aspect of combat except John Dollard's classic study of the volunteers for the Lincoln Brigade and some anecdotal evidence from the Confederate units of the Civil War. So willingness to forsake family is very important. Another one is what we call the spiritual dimension of human conflict. Okay, so this is the continuous thing we had on an iPad, but think of a set of bodies, of 5 bodies. One's small and sort of flaccid, and they get stronger and bigger and more muscular, right? And this is from evolutionary theory. When you get a little creature is attacked by a big creature, the little creature pumps himself up, and the big creature goes off and says, oh, this isn't worth it, I'm going to eat somebody else. So we actually propose these body types, and we ask people to rate themselves, rate all the other combatants. But here's the thing. When we did this with ISIS and PKK, these 2 groups on the U.S. terrorist list, by the way, PKK was the only group with YPG, their sister group in Syria, that resisted the Islamic State on the front line. They threw away the cards, and they said, this is not important. The only thing that's important is what's in your spirit, what's in your heart. Ruhi bighayri, which was the word used both in Kurdish and Arabic. So we took the same stimuli and simply just changed the frame and paired physical force versus spiritual force. This is the ratings, the average ratings that all combatants gave on all sides to say the United, we rated everybody, but this is just to give you an example, of all combatants to the United States versus ISIS. And as you see, they rate the United States as physically maximal, spiritually middling. They rate ISIS itself, as you'll see, rates itself as physically middling or very weak, but spiritually extremely strong. And all believe, except for American forces, but not American special forces, that spirit trumps material force, all other things being equal. Let me just give you a very fast, so you saw the front line in the very first slide. This will just to give you an example of what a field setup looks like. It's nothing like to do with students, these weird populations of Western educated, industrialized, rich, developed people, which is well over 90% of psychology studies. So you have to run experiments very differently. And I'll just show you how an experiment is actually run in the field if I can get this moving. Okay, so that's a front line. We're about 800 meters from the ISIS front line. This is a Peshmerga force at the Burj outpost. And so we go in and that's Ho Shang, he's that playwright, and that's Lydia. She's the Cambridge Literary Review person, medieval Arabic philosopher. And we're using those cards, those are the body types there. And you see, you just don't do, first we do a lot of field work in which we do ethnographic field work to find out who these people are, where they come from, and then we only run the experiment after a long time. We think surveys are basically worthless, and we never use them. So we do these in-depth sorts of things, and these can take hours, rather than just, as in a classroom, a few minutes. Let me show you another one. This is with an ISIS fighter. Now, you see, it's very intuitive for them. There's no obfuscation. Of course, we do things like voice stress analysis to find out whether they're lying or not. But, you know, I've been doing this stuff for 40 years in pretty dangerous places. And if I'm lied to often enough, well, I can't be, or I'd be dead. So you get used to when people are bullshitting you or not. But anyway, we do monitor. And we ask questions not about operations, like who did you fight, where did you come from, who recruited you. We ask strange things like, oh, well, what if a child born of Zionist parents was raised by the Mujahideen? Would it grow up to be a Zionist or a Mujahid? They never heard of anything like this, but it's quite revealing about what they think. In the case of Mujahideen, they'd grow up to be a Mujahid. In the case of Christian identity, a Jew is a Jew, and a devil is a devil. Here's a Peshmerga doing that task with ISIS, and you'll see how simple it is for him. So he's doing ISIS on the right. He's asking physical force and spiritual force. So that's physical, spiritual. And this is the guy fighting ISIS, right? That's the first time he ever saw this. Okay, so what is the Islamic State? And why terror? So this is the Idarat al-Tawahush, Tawahush from Wahsh, which means animal, the management of savagery and chaos, by al-Baji, an Egyptian philosopher of the jihad, which is a required reading for all the emirs of the Islamic State. And there are some interesting principles in this. One of the principles is to sow terror. Now, the reason is you want to take over places where there's chaos, like in Africa, manage it, and where in the land of your enemies you want to create chaos. And how do you do that? Well, you attack soft targets. You attack restaurants and theaters and cafes and sporting events, things that cannot possibly be defended. And then you accomplish two things. First, you undermine the citizens, the enemy's citizens' faith in their own government's ability to provide security, the fundamental responsibility of any government. And that we see, of course, happening, and that's why we got the leaders we do. And the second thing you do is you eliminate the gray zone, which is the area in which most of humanity lives between true believers and infidels. And you eliminate the gray zone by causing suspicion against all Muslims, right? And when you cause suspicion against them, you show them that trying to live in peace only brings pain. And so you force them to join either the true infidels, the infidels are the true believers, and hopefully they'll join the believers. But it's not, I'm not interested in terrorism. I think that's a worthless concept, like guns or ammunition as a natural kind. There's no scientific study of terrorism. There's no laws of terrorism. It's a method. And in fact, I think ISIS is a classic revolution of cause and camaraderie, using the same methods as any classic revolution. In this case, for example, terror. As Robespierre said in 1794, right before he himself succumbed to his own concept, virtue without which terror is destructive, terror without which virtue is impotent. Terror is only justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. For without a belief in moral virtue, it is, for me at least, I think, literally inconceivable to want to harm, to want to kill thousands, millions of people innocent of direct harms for others. It has to be a deeply morally driven virtue. And this is quite the opposite of the notion that people think these people are nihilists or brainwashing. You know, brainwashing is a fiction that comes out of the Korean War. When 100 Brits and Americans didn't want to go back, someone wrote The Manchurian Candidate, right, where a bunch of social engineering wizards from Red China used Pavlovian techniques to wash the brains of these Brits. And all of a sudden there's brainwashing, which is an empty and meaningless concept, usually used by parents to try to explain what happened to their children when they go off to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, because, you know, contrary to the notion of a clash of civilizations, it's actually a crash of territorial cultures. As the vertical lines of communications between elders and youngers are sundered, this is the dark side of globalization, and young people are hooking up horizontally, and coming up with these new modes of being. Now, ISIS is a festive and joyous movement of moral rectitude, obligation, and duty to community. Often I talk to the women who join ISIS, and they argue that they join because the West is nihilistic. There are no moral principles left. They don't know when a woman is a woman and a man is a man, and they want clear red lines. They want to know who they are. It's not about fascial attraction or brainwashing or nihilism. And now I ask you, what dreams may come from current government policies that offer little beyond grudging promises of comfort and security? People who are willing to sacrifice everything, including their lives, the totality of their self-interests, won't be lured by material incentives or disincentives. Now, you also hear preaching of moderation. Now, one way we're going to get these people out of the attraction of the Islamic State is to preach moderation. Well, it's sort of crazy if you had teenage children and you know how much moderation works on them. Like, it's sort of nutty, but yet that's sort of the general view. If you look at just the Twitter feeds of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Yemen, 57% are about social development projects, especially targeted to youth. Only 3% are about killings and executions, okay? 18% are about religion, including those 3%. Yet our propaganda is almost exactly the opposite, stands it on its head. All we talk about is the killing, the barbarity and cruelness, which it has, forgetting what attracts people to it. There's a focus on ideology and counter-narratives, as if ideas were free-floating in the air, somehow invaded minds as memes, and I have a long story about memes, which we do experiments on. And then the way to counter this is with a counter-narrative or a counter-ideology, okay? But take a more epidemiological approach. Ideas are embedded in brains in social networks. If you look at the recruitment patterns for ISIS, for example, they're extremely clustered in very particular neighborhoods, in very particular groups. If it was just ideology floating around in social media, you have a randomized enlistment and recruitment pattern. You have quite the opposite. If you look at the, just to give you an example, take the Paris-Brussels networks, which we've been looking into very, very deeply, which now involve hundreds of people. We found that these networks stretch back to the Algerian-inspired attacks in Paris in the 1990s. One woman, Fatima Abrakan, who brought in Zerkani, who was the principal recruiter for ISIS, her brother was the guy who gave the false passports to Ahmed Shah Massoud, to the killers of Ahmed Shah Massoud that triggered a 9/11. We find connections all the way to the Jama'a Islamiyah. These networks are quite vast in time, but here's the problem. The police and the security only look at perpetrators, where in fact these networks are deep, deep networks of communities, of families, of fellow travelers, and would collapse without them. The women have the highest betweenness and centrality factors of these networks. None of them, or very few of them, are under police surveillance or even in the record because they haven't committed any crimes. Yet the way the Jama'a Islamiyah networks, well, another group that we worked with, was actually reconstituted after they decapitated, I don't mean physically, they got rid of all their leaders, was they never looked at the driver who drove the leaders. He knew where everybody was. So he was able to reconnect everybody else. These facilitators are as important or more important. Not only that, these aren't networks of criminals. They're very different than criminal networks. First, often, I mean, France is a very peculiar, and Belgium are very peculiar, because 7–8% of the French population is Muslim, but 60 to 70% of the prison population is young Muslim man, like blacks in South Chicago. So you get a very, very peculiar view of the Islamic State if you look at France, and an even more peculiar one of so-called lone wolves, which are extremely rare, if at all happen, in the United States. But for the rest of the world, it's extremely varied recruitment. I mean, I got a call from the head of the medical school in Khartoum. Her entire A class went to Raqqa to establish a clinic. The guys who came into Mosul, who downloaded $400 million on that Saturday in early August, were engineering students from Algiers who, when the Kurdish bank manager asked, why did you join ISIS, well, said, I got a computer degree and I wanted to do something good with my life. So I should move on. So rather than counter-narratives, combating ideologies, I think it's much more important to think about counter-engagement. Intimate counter-engagement with groups in their networks. ISIS will literally spend hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours on a single person, saying, we know how hard it is for you to leave your mother and father and come here, but let us explain to you why honoring your parents isn't the only thing to do. Now, this doesn't always happen, but it never happens on our side with public diplomacy, which is mostly negative, mass messaging that lecture to young people without offering them anything positive. When we interviewed one imam who was a recruiter in Syria for the Islamic State who defected to Al-Qaeda, by the way, because he thought that the killing of guests was unallowed. He said, look, I was a recruiter, right? I would pick the ones who had the most, this is in the Middle East, the most passion and the most heart. And we've got to give them a positive message. Otherwise, we're going to lose to ISIS. That's a point when Al-Qaeda was reaching out because they had just been excommunicated by ISIS, and so they were talking to everybody, even me. It's not the case, of course, with many of the locals who just joined ISIS because they were being shafted. After the Sunnis had shafted them for 100 years, the Americans came along and said, let's have a democracy, let's have a vote. But if you think about democracy, it took 150 years to develop in Europe. Okay? First, under Napoleon I, you had tolerance of religions. Then, with Napoleon III, you had things like legislatures, right to strike, right of work, opposition press. The last thing was universal suffrage, right? Well, when the United States invaded Iraq, the first thing was universal suffrage. So but they had no liberal institutions. So all you had was a tyranny of the majority where they shafted the others. And all these young kids who joined ISIS were telling us they joined simply because it was impossible to live. Our parents were killed, our uncles were killed, we couldn't go out of the house for weeks at a time. It was a no-brainer. In fact, everybody joined ISIS. Even those fighting with the coalition now joined ISIS. The reason they left ISIS is because there happened to be many of the sheikhs, the rich ones. So ISIS comes in, there's usually a 2-week amnesty, no one's killed, the lights are functioning, the markets are working, the courts are working, and then ISIS says, okay, look at that sheikh over there, he's got that nice pickup truck, you got nothing, he's got all that land, why don't you take it? So the guys they took it from then went to join the coalition. So what do we do about it? Well, I said counter-engagement, but here's the problem. Young people are looked at as a youth bulge, not as the youth boom, as they were looked at in the United States following World War II. Perhaps the most creative force in history, that youth boom. Now they're only looked at as a bulge to be hammered. Especially young men, but increasingly young women, everybody wants to clobber them. Nobody wants to give them any kind of novel ability to create things. There are some exceptions. One is young women peace speeders, aware girls. These are 2 teenagers, 15 and 16 years old, a decade ago, Sabah and Gulalai Ismail in northwest Pakistan. They built a women's advocacy group. They drew in a bunch of young men because young men are attracted to young women on the whole. And they turned around 1,500 young men who were about to join the Taliban. 50. Those in turn reached out to 50. Now they got 1,500 in their network working for this. Another one is peer-to-peer. Jessica introduced me to Tony Skro, who developed this with Facebook. And they are in 70 countries doing things like theater, young people's initiatives that are working marvelously. But the problem is, unlike ISIS, and I'm about to finish up, unlike ISIS, there's no universal platform for this. You know, I spoke to the UN General Assembly when we passed UN Resolution 2015, and our recommendation to the member states was to develop a youth-centered initiatives for countering violent extremists, because they're the most successful by far. And so we had a world forum in Amman, and young people came in from all over the world, everywhere. Great ideas, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful ideas. But then they had a Kumbaya movement, everybody's swaying together, and they're going, governments of the world must do this, and governments of the world must do that, and they got to stop doing this. And I said, geez, this is dead. Because no one was telling them, well, they got to live with governments. They got to convince governments, even corrupt governments. They got to navigate through governments. But no one was showing them any way to do that. And so it was going nowhere. And now, a conclusion. So civilizations rise and fall on the vitality of cultural ideas, not material assets alone. History shows that societies have sacred values for which people would passionately fight, even unto death, rather than compromise. As for many who join ISIS, and many, especially some Kurds, who oppose them. But we find no comparable willingness among Western youth to make those kinds of sacrifices. And I ask you to go onto your computers one day and just look at a one-page book review of Mein Kampf by George Orwell. And Orwell asks, how is it that the socialist countries, and to a more grudging extent, the capitalist countries, offer their people ease, security, avoidance of pain, health, hygiene, birth control, in short, the good life. And our Oxford Student Union, the cream of our intellectuals, say they will never fight again for any values of democracy. And Mr. Hitler, what's he offering his people? Death, danger, destruction, change, glory, adventure, revolution. Hitler knows, says Orwell, that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general, the hedonistic life. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice. Above all, cultural vitality requires a transcendent message and meaning that gives individual existence significance beyond death, binds people together beyond perceived self-interest, and hopefully creates enduring and peaceful progress towards a common good. But what is being offered to us at Davos, where I was with Molly back in January? A forced gamble of the creative destruction of market liberalism. Now, as I responded to Jim Berger yesterday, Europeans and Americans have had 200 years to adapt to this forced gamble. The rest of the world only since World War II. And they've lost it. And millennial traditions have disappeared. Half the world's languages have been gone since World War II, and a third are stuck in New Guinea. There's nothing to fall back on. So people are looking for re-enchantment, re-engagement with their communities, re-ritualization. And that's what they're finding in these groups. And so lastly, I ask, this is the choice that we seem to be faced with at this time. Which way do we go? By the way, that you can't see it, that's a guy lying on a bed with dollar bills going, commit to something. This is right in front of the Freedom Tower in New York. Okay, thank you.